September 2nd, 1878, 3:42 p.m. The shutter snapped. The moment froze on glass. Elias Trundell lowered his head from the black cloth draped over the brass frame, his breath catching slightly in his throat. A thin drizzle had just begun, a fine mist barely perceptible unless one tilted their head skyward, but it was enough to make the trees shiver. The subject, a man named Edwin Harrow, stood still beneath the boughs of a weathered elm, waistcoat buttoned tight, shoulders hunched as if bracing against something colder than rain. He held a closed umbrella, not above him, but gripped like a cane, tip resting beside a shallow puddle at his feet. "You may relax now, sir," Elias called, stepping forward. His tone was courteous but distracted. Something felt off. The air had shifted during the shot. A quiet had crept in, not the usual hush of rural calm, but a waiting silence, taut like a held breath. Elias noticed the leaves no longer rustled. Even the telegraph lines that normally sang with faint vibration had fallen mute. He shook it off. He slid the plate out and laid it gently into the developing tray, careful not to let his breath fog the chemicals. Silver nitrate hissed softly as the image began to emerge, and for a few seconds it appeared like any other portrait. Sepia tones, stiff posture, blurred edges softened by lens aberration. The umbrella, the waistcoat, the trees behind. Then Elias froze. Above the puddles, just behind Harrow's right side, something was rising, or had risen. The emulsion caught it faintly but unmistakably. Dozens of small glass-clear forms, teardrop-shaped and weightless. They hovered several inches above the puddle's surface, not within it. Trails stretched behind them, thin, upward blurs, as if the droplets had lifted from the water with gentle force. He leaned closer. Not smudges, not dust, not stray reflections. He held his breath and adjusted the lamp. No mistake. One drop, perhaps the clearest, was suspended directly above a slick cobblestone, perfectly centered with a tail that curved like it had been pushed by wind. But the trees behind it remained still, unmoved. Elias's hands trembled as he lifted the tray and carried it to the drying line. The plate was heavy and slick, its edges burning slightly from the silver solution. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. A voice broke the silence behind him. "Is something wrong?" Edwin Harrow stepped into the studio tent, brushing mist from his lapel. Elias didn't answer. His gaze was locked on the plate. Instead, he muttered to himself, almost too quietly to hear, "They're not falling." "What's that?" "Nothing," Elias replied quickly, setting the plate down and turning away. But his mind was racing. He had developed hundreds of photographs, endured ruined plates from unstable chemicals, warped glass from heat, fogged frames from breath and tremor, but this was none of those. These droplets were spaced in impossible alignment, like a constellation drawn not by chance, but by a ruler. He fetched a magnifier, ignoring Edwin's continued conversation. His assistant, Henry, entered the tent moments later carrying the tripod, and paused mid-step when he saw Elias hunched over the plate, unmoving. "Sir?" Elias didn't look up. "Fetch the exposure log." Now Henry obeyed. The ledger was old and bound in buckled leather, its ink smudged from years of weathered fingers. Elias flipped to the page. Clouds split, light uncommonly clear, drizzle persisted. His pencil hovered. He turned the plate sideways under the magnifier, inspecting the drops again. Still there. Each blur had a faint radiance around it, barely visible but distinctly separate from the surrounding grain. It looked deliberate. He picked up a charcoal pencil and hesitated. On the glass's edge, just beside the darkened border, he scribbled a single note. They were going home. He didn't know why he wrote it, didn't fully understand what it meant, but it had pressed itself into his mind like an impression left by something that had already left. It didn't feel poetic. It felt observed. Later that night, he locked the plate in a wooden slide case and stored it beneath the chapel where the chemicals were kept cool. He told no one else. The image unsettled him, not just because of what it showed, but because of what it lacked. Rain had been falling, but there was no rain in the sky of the photograph. The puddles shone with reflection, but no droplets broke their surface. The man had stood still, but the air around him had moved. Not wind. Something else. That night, Elias returned to his boarding room with a tightness in his chest. He lit no lantern. He stared at his ceiling and listened to the stillness press against the window pane. He would develop more images over the coming weeks, but none like that. None with the upward blur. None with the silence that seemed to hum. It would take another 69 years before the plate would be re-examined at the Westfield Photographic Registry in Massachusetts, where technicians enlarged the grains and verified the impossible alignment of the droplets. They found no signs of tampering, no signs of mirrored printing, no overlapping exposure layers, and no trace of chemical disturbance. The streaks, they confirmed, pointed upward, not by mistake, not by optical illusion, but by motion. Motion captured, going the wrong way. They called in physicists, chemists, and optics specialists. Each one came to the same conclusion. The plate had captured something, but not the truth as we understand it. Rain had just begun to tap against the window panes of Millvale's modest photography studio when Elias Trundell adjusted the tripod with a soft grunt. He was not a patient man by nature, but he respected stillness. It was 1878, and the Weston Model B camera before him demanded obedience, not haste. Each silver halide plate was precious, and any disruption, even the tremor of a nearby wagon, could ruin the exposure. "Sir," Trundell said without looking up, "if we wait another 5 minutes, the storm may pass." The plate will fog behind him. A man in a burgundy waistcoat lifted a closed umbrella and planted its tip into the muddy earth outside the doorway. "I said it must be now," the man insisted. His voice was polite, but thin and urgent, like a violin string pulled too tight. "The tree. It must be beneath the tree." Trundell hesitated, then jotted the time in his ledger. 3:42 p.m. Clouds overhead had split, letting through an oddly clear silver light. It wasn't like normal sunlight. It had no warmth. The subject, a traveling surveyor from the local government, if Trundell recalled correctly, stepped beneath the oak tree just 20 feet from the chapel rectory. He held the umbrella closed at his side despite the drizzle, which Trundell found peculiar. Everyone in Vermont knew how to read the sky, but this man seemed in defiance of it. Trundell exhaled and prepared the plate. The emulsion shimmered faintly under the dim light of the darkroom. Silver nitrate, collodion, ether, chemicals he trusted more than men. Outside, the gravel road curved past the chapel and the iron rail fence. A telegraph line buzzed above, crackling faintly. Unusual, given the dry air. Trundell fixed the brass Petzval lens and whispered, "Hold." Then, with practiced fingers, he uncapped the lens. 13 seconds of exposure. 13 seconds of silence. Only the faint patter of rain on leaves, and beneath it, a sound. A clicking. Light, soft, mechanical, but above the tree. Not around it. Trundell didn't look up. He knew not to move during exposure. When he capped the lens again and pulled the slide, the subject lowered the umbrella slowly, eyes tracing something above. "Did you hear it?" the man asked, his voice lower now. "I heard nothing," Trundell lied. "We're done here." Back inside, the tray sizzled as developer met the plate. Shapes began to emerge. The tree, the umbrella, the distant chapel spire. And then Trundell dropped his tongs. The metal clattered across the counter. Something shimmered in the background. Dozens of droplets. Suspended. Not beneath the puddles. Not resting on leaves. Above them. Each tear-shaped blur pointed upward, defying motion, defying gravity. Trundell leaned close, heart beating faster. It wasn't a double exposure. The subject's outline was clean, the background unwarped. A pencil scribble found its way into the ledger's margin. Rain began, but subject insisted umbrella was shut. That evening the storm passed, but the tension did not. The air grew heavier as dusk crept in. Across Millvale Parish, something felt off-kilter. Horses refused to drink from the eastern trough. Birds circled low, then vanished into trees without song. At the chapel, a young curate named Father Delwyn stepped out to retrieve the bell rope after the vesper call. He paused under the same oak where the photograph had been taken. There was no rain, but he saw puddles. Fresh, circular. Thunder, he wrote in his chapel notes later that night, without sound this day. Air felt wrong. In the years that followed, Trundell said little. He printed only one copy of the photograph and sealed the original plate in a cloth-lined tin, which he later stored beneath the chapel's rectory in an iron cabinet alongside his other undeveloped stock. No one asked why he abandoned photography in the months after. He died in 1881 from what the attending doctor called fevered confusion, a state of unbroken panic and muttering. His final words, reportedly whispered to a church deacon, were, "They're not reflections." It might have ended there. But in 1894, across the ocean in Firthwood, England, a nearly identical image surfaced. A boy under an arch of trees, holding a tin toy. Around him, not falling leaves, but dry leaves, rising. No direct connection to Trundell existed, but the resemblance was uncanny. Same alignment, same upward motion, same clear, rainless light. The scientific community sought an answer. Officials from the Vermont Photographic Society examined Trundell's plates. Some blamed plate warping from humidity. Others proposed emulsion recoil, though no records ever defined such a term. Those who tested similar chemicals found no such behavior, no precedent, no error to replicate. Still, explanations circulated, anything to silence the unease. But deep within the Millvale Records archive, handwritten in the corner of a parish ledger, another note appeared decades later beside Trundell's entry. The explanations faded, but the rain kept rising in the frame. The plate hissed softly in the chemical bath, steam curling from the edges of the tray like breath from a shallow grave. Elias Trundell stood over the developer table in his chapel-dark studio beneath Millvale's rectory, hands trembling as he reached for the brass tongs resting beside the basin. The moment his fingers touched metal, he flinched, then dropped them with a loud clang against the stone floor. The clatter echoed through the vaulted chamber, too loud for the hour, too sharp for the air. His breathing quickened. He stared down at the half-developed glass plate submerged in the shallow dish. The image was beginning to emerge. Soft lines, the silhouette of the man under the tree. His closed umbrella pointed downward like a blade. But it wasn't the subject that held Elias captive. It was what surrounded him. Above the puddles at his feet, small shapes were forming, elongated, clear forms suspended in midair, blurred yet precise, rising. He wiped the sweat from his temple with his sleeve and leaned closer. The liquid rippled as his breath disturbed the surface. The droplets, if that's what they were, had faint motion trails, thin like filament, all pointing up, not down, not sideways. Up, he whispered to himself. What? Behind him, Trundell's assistant, Henry Bell, hovered in the doorway. A younger man with calloused hands and soot around his fingernails from the coal furnace, Henry spoke cautiously. "You all right, sir?" Trundell didn't answer at first. He stared at the plate as though it had just whispered something to him in return. Then, softly, "They're leaving." "Sir?" He didn't respond again. He lifted the plate carefully, draining the developer across the grooves in the drying tray, and tilted it toward the oil lamp overhead. His face went pale. "I need the ledger," he said suddenly, voice hollow. Henry fetched the bound book from the writing desk. Trundell opened to the page dated September 2nd. In a hurried scrawl, beneath the weather notes he had jotted earlier, clouds split. Light uncommonly clear. Drizzle persisted. He added a single line in pencil along the bottom edge of the plate's cardboard sleeve. They were going home. Henry furrowed his brow. Who? Trundell didn't answer. Instead, he reached for the envelope they used to send out plates to Boston for a second opinion analysis. Wrap this, he said, and write to Elwick. Thomas Elwick, the chemical photographer in Boston, was known for his obsession with flawed exposures and rare plate reactions. When the envelope reached him 3 days later, he responded not with formal correspondence, but with a telegram. This is not backward motion. This is something leaving. No further explanation. Back in Millvale, Elias Trundell had not been seen outdoors since the development. He ate little. He slept less. When Henry visited on the 5th day to deliver a client's payment, he found the curtains drawn, the air stifling with vinegar and smoke. Trundell stood barefoot near the window, muttering over the edge of his diary. They weren't reflections, he whispered. They weren't even part of us. Henry took a careful step forward. Sir, the bishop asked after you this morning. Said you haven't turned in your copies for the chapel newsletter. They're not reflections, Trundell repeated, voice brittle. They were always above. We just didn't see them until the drizzle. What were? Trundell looked up at him with red-ringed eyes but said nothing. By the end of the week, Elias Trundell's condition worsened. He was found by a parish warden in the studio cellar, collapsed beside the drying racks. A physician diagnosed him with fever-induced delirium. He raved for 3 nights in his cot, murmuring of spirals in the air and clicks between the branches. On the 4th night, he died. The attending curate marked the cause as fevered confusion, a phrase the death register hadn't used in years. The plate, now dry, remained in the studio's iron cabinet, sealed in its envelope, beneath the row of unused Weston Model B tripod legs. Weeks later, Henry sent a second copy to a weather journal in Montpelier, Vermont, seeking clarification about the conditions on September 2nd. The response was immediate and puzzling. Rain had been recorded that afternoon in surrounding towns, Brindle Creek, Hollow's Gate, and Graythorne, but not in Millvale. Their observer marked the hour as overcast but dry. No thunder, no downpour, and yet the photo showed puddles, wet ground, damp leaves. The subject's boots had a clear shine of moisture. The umbrella, still folded, showed no signs of water on its surface. The inconsistencies mounted. No mist appeared on the lens edges. No aperture misfire. The brass Petzval lens had captured other exposures perfectly that week. The ground was wet, but the sky above in the image, crisp, cloudless. No fall-off, no fog. It made no sense. Henry returned once more to the site of the photograph, the east slope near Hawthorn Tree Hollow. The tree still stood. Leaves twitched gently in the afternoon breeze, but as he approached he felt something strange, like walking into a space just vacated by a louder noise. Silence, but not peace. He stood beneath the boughs, looked up. There were no droplets in the air, no drizzle, no rain, only the faintest hint of a sound. Click, 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 far above, as though something, unseen, retreated into the branches. He backed away slowly. Later that year, when an archivist from the parish filed the plate among others in the rectory basement, he paused to read the handwritten pencil note on the sleeve. He frowned. They were going home, he read aloud, then looked over his shoulder. The room was quiet. A final detail remained, nearly forgotten. In a separate ledger, found decades later by photographic analysts in 1947, the same exposure was listed again, this time annotated with a final witness comment collected from a parish neighbor who had walked past the slope that same afternoon. She had seen the man posing. She remembered no rain, but she added one thing. There was a noise, above the trees. Not thunder, not birds. Like a clicking, soft but close. I thought it was a machine. The investigators underlined the note in red ink. Witnesses remembered no rain, only a soft clicking noise above the trees. The mercury refused to fall. Professor Alwyn Knorr narrowed his eyes as the droplets hung in the vacuum tube like suspended silver beads. The Invermont School of Natural Physics had given him access to their sealed testing chamber that spring of 1882, and what began as a simple attempt to simulate reverse gravity had turned into something far stranger. His assistant, Merrick, stood silent beside him, scribbling quick notations into a leather-bound logbook. The hiss of the vacuum pump filled the chamber like an anxious breath being held. Knorr adjusted the copper coil at the base of the containment tube. The mercury droplets should have responded, either drifting, falling, or at the very least coalescing into a base pool. But instead, they aligned unnaturally, forming a single, unwavering vertical line from bottom to top. "They're not behaving like fluid," Knorr murmured, his voice hollow, as though he feared hearing himself speak. Merrick looked up. "They're locked." "No," Knorr said slowly, fingers tightening around the brass dial. "They're listening." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence. 3 weeks earlier, Dr. Felix Morrow had sent Knorr the original plate, Trundell's image, under special courier from the Callum Institute. The letter accompanying it had been sealed in wax, marked Private, Optics Archive Only. Knorr recalled the first line precisely. "This plate is optically obscene." At first, he dismissed it as the poetic exaggeration of a sleepless scientist. But after his own initial inspection under the arc lamp, he understood. The raindrops, if that was what they were not merely captured in an upward motion. Their shape was too precise, too self-contained. When viewed through the retinal photometer, each teardrop appeared to shimmer faintly, as if reacting to the act of observation. He had blinked, backed away from the plate, and whispered, "This isn't a photograph." "It's a reply." Knorr's experiment with mercury followed days of failure using traditional light refraction models. He had tried bouncing sodium arcs across misted glass, then flooding dark chambers with blue gas and photographing under long exposure. Nothing captured the effect. So he moved to mercury, the most responsive of fluids, and still the results mocked him. In a final attempt, he raised the ambient temperature in the sealed chamber. The mercury droplets began to vibrate faintly, then froze mid-motion. A low, vibrating tone issued from the coil. Knorr's breath caught. "Do you hear that?" he asked, eyes wide. Merrick leaned in. "It's not from the pump." The tone lasted for 12 seconds. When it ceased, all the mercury collapsed at once, violently, as if a thread had snapped. The force shattered the glass containment. Neither man spoke for nearly a minute. That night, Knorr wrote a terse note to Dr. Morrow. "It reacts." And not to light. By morning, he received a reply via wire. Then seal it. Seal it now. Do not attempt replication again. But Knorr had already arranged to have the original plate delivered to the Millvale Historical Museum under temporary protection. The curator, a reclusive man named Bellington, had granted him access to their restricted catalog to cross-reference any items tied to Trundell's work. What he found shook him. Item number 2, 41-IX. A plate card handwritten in pale graphite. No date, no signature. Only, "One plate. Do not mirror mirror." Knorr froze in the corridor, the card still in his hand. He raced back to his temporary lab quarters, pulling the original image from its envelope. He hadn't dared reverse it yet, fearing it would show nothing. But now, he had to know. Under dim lamplight, he placed the glass plate over a silvered surface and tilted it carefully. What reflected wasn't simply the same image reversed, it was darker, more crowded. The trees in the background appeared doubled. The drops had changed position. They pointed, not upward, but outward. nor recoiled. It's not a reflection. It's something else entirely. Later, back at his home in Doorbridge, he met Morrow in person. The elder doctor looked exhausted, his white hair thinner than Knorr remembered. They sat by the hearth as rain patted lightly against the windows. "I tried sealing the plate," Morrow confessed, taking a sip of tea. "Iron box, lined with sea salt. Buried it for 3 nights. It fogged the lining, but not the glass. Whatever it is, it doesn't want to be confined." Knorr's voice was barely above a whisper. "Do you think it's emitting?" "I don't think any more," Morrow muttered, staring into the fire. "I watch." The following morning, Morrow returned to Callum. He left behind the sea salt box, empty now except for the fine residue and a single line written on its underside in ink. "They do not fall. They arrive." In December of that year, archivist C. DeLorme, stationed at the parish library, sent a telegraph. It was short, urgent. Trundell's image repeats in others. Not copied. Grown. The message sent a chill through Knorr's spine. That same week, he received 2 new submissions for review, glass plate photographs, one from Halifax, another from near Firthwood. Both captured forest scenes. Both showed small, perfectly formed droplets suspended above the earth. Knorr resigned the next day. His letter simply read, "My perception has reversed. Long-term vertigo and reversals. I cannot maintain professional judgment." At the Millvale Museum, the original Trundell plate was reclassified. It was no longer permitted to be displayed, even to scholars. The catalog entry remained, but now included one final note in red ink, added by DeLorme himself. They believed it was emitting, not recording. The first crack in the theory came quietly, during a midnight experiment in a frost-laced laboratory on the outskirts of Doorhaven. Professor Alwyn Knorr, his spectacles fogging with every breath, watched a thin mercury droplet resist gravity inside a vacuum-sealed glass tube. It was meant to simulate optical contraction, a rare but rumored effect caused by unstable barometric pressure during photographic exposure. The droplet didn't fall, nor did it rise. Instead, it trembled, then split cleanly in 2, the halves hovering in a thin vertical line before collapsing silently to the bottom of the tube. Knorr stepped back, startled, his gloved hands trembling slightly. He scribbled a note. "Observed reversal fails. Motion ceases before force applies." For a scientist devoted to order, the moment was quietly terrifying. His colleague, Dr. Felix Morrow of the Callum Institute, had already dismissed the emulsion recoil theory. "Instability doesn't make precision," he said, pacing beneath the arched brass lamps of the reading room. "Look at the Trundell plate. Those droplets are equidistant, measured spacing of 3.7 centimeters between each. That's not chaos. That's intent." To disprove sabotage, Morrow had personally arranged a series of recreations. Identical silver halide plates, Weston Model B tripod, brass Petzval lens, same exposure time, drizzle simulated with a fine pipette mist, plate after plate, nothing reversed, nothing blurred upward, nothing resembled the Millvale image. "We would have seen some anomaly," Morrow muttered as he leaned over the final dry plate. "But all I see is gravity, like a good citizen." His assistant, Nolan, raised an eyebrow. "You're saying it wasn't human error?" Morrow didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the sealed drawer containing the original Trundell plate. Though its surface was protected under thick glass, he never touched it directly. Not after the film developed under his own microscope began curling without heat. It had left behind what he described as a pale trail, like mist being pulled through unseen thread. In 1956, decades later, the Veridan Forensic Laboratory was granted temporary access to the original image. Their spectral grain analysis confirmed what Morrow had long suspected. The exposure was clean. No light leaks, no mirrored plates, no dual exposure. The emulsion's silver nitrate base showed no evidence of physical tampering. The upward streaks were original to the moment of capture. So, if it wasn't sabotage, and it wasn't chemical— Knorr returned to the lab one final time, desperate to prove a new theory he dared not publish: spatial refraction breach. "The rain we see," he whispered to himself, "wasn't from here." He had once studied an obscure case from Firthwood, England, dated 1894, a sepia-toned image of a crumbling orchard. It was almost forgotten until a museum intern noticed something off. A cluster of leaves suspended mid-air, unnaturally frozen, stems pointing upward toward the canopy, as if being drawn into the sky. The man beneath the tree, smiling faintly at the camera, showed no sign of disturbance. His coat fell naturally. His boots were firmly planted, yet the leaves above him betrayed some unseen rupture. Knorr had compared the two plates, the rain in Millvale, the leaves in Firthwood. Both were identically spaced, 3.7 centimeters apart. Both showed only inanimate matter affected. Knorr's hands trembled as he turned the prints under a warm reading lamp. "What is this?" he whispered. "Why does it affect the world, but not the people inside it?" No one could answer. Professor Eldon Westbrook, a former cartographer turned lens historian, once suggested the images were not documents, but windows. "We are not seeing movement," he said. "We are seeing migration." When asked to clarify, he only added, "a piece of something else bleeding through. Somewhere that doesn't follow our rules." Still, others clung to simpler explanations. Charles Elwick, a chemical photographer from Boston, proposed the idea of image drag, a phantom effect caused by lingering particles on unsealed plate edges. But even he admitted the spacing was too precise. "If this is motion blur," he had said, tapping his pen against a diagram, "then the motion was not natural. It was programmed." Dr. Morrow, exhausted and half disbelieving, penned a final note in his 1886 journal before vanishing from public record. "It does not distort. It replaces. The photograph is not backward. It is leaving." Weeks later, a card in the Millvale Historical Museum was quietly filed. Item number 2, 41-IX. One plate, do not mirror. No explanation followed, only silence. And the plate, still sealed, resting beneath a double-locked cabinet. Archivist C. DeLorme, reviewing old telegrams in 1889, found one addressed to him from a colleague in Ireland. It referenced a different photo, one that had grown. Not copied, not printed, grown. He wrote back only one word: "How?" The reply never came. By the time Knorr resigned in 1890, citing reversals and long-term vertigo, no one wanted to discuss the Trundell photograph anymore. Its mention in academia declined. Lectures were canceled, access restricted. And still, the raindrops hung mid-air, their upward tails frozen in silver nitrate, perfectly spaced, immune to logic. Whatever it wasn't falling, and it wasn't local. The door to the analysis chamber at the University of Doorbridge was ajar. Janitor Thomas Vey hesitated at the threshold. The corridor behind him was dark and silent, save for the low hum of the gas-powered heating system that pulsed faintly through the old stone walls. He shifted the weight of his mop bucket and stepped inside. The room was awash in faint blue light from an arc lamp still glowing behind a stack of prism filters. Machinery ticked softly, the kind that should have been shut down hours ago. Thomas frowned. The room smelled strange, not of chemicals but something metallic and damp, like the inside of a locked cellar after rain. He moved slowly, eyes sweeping the lab benches. Papers had been scattered. A metal ruler had fallen to the floor and lay next to a stool turned slightly off-center, as though someone had stood and not returned. Then he saw them. A pair of brown leather gloves rested neatly on the table. Not abandoned. Placed. Fingers curled inward, one slightly overlapping the other. Still warm, Thomas noticed when he reached out and touched them, warm like hands had been in them only moments before, but there was no one in the room. "Professor Levan," he called, his voice barely louder than the machines around him. No reply. He stepped around the central table and saw the photograph. It lay under a glass dome at the center of the viewing station. It wasn't large, only a few inches wide, but something about it pulled the eye unnaturally. The image seemed to vibrate at the edges, not visibly, but in a way that made Thomas's vision feel unstable. He squinted. The plate was coated in a thin, oily film, as though a drop of ink had been spun outward from its center. Each of the suspended raindrops seemed to ripple ever so slightly beneath the surface. The cabinet beside it had condensation forming beneath its shelves. Not above, not around, beneath. Beads of water had gathered on the underside of the glass like breath on a mirror, and a faint line of mist swirled near the floor. Thomas backed up. He felt something tightening in his chest, a pressure he couldn't name. He turned to the phone on the wall, hand trembling slightly as he lifted the receiver. But the line was dead. Just a crackle. He set it back in place without dialing. Professor Levan had signed out the lab at 9:05 p.m., according to the registry. It was now past 3 a.m., 6 hours unaccounted for. There were no signs of forced entry. No notes, no coat, no bag, not even a mug left behind. Nothing but those gloves, placed like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one had written. Thomas bent closer to the dome. At the edge of the plate, barely visible under the sheen of the spiral residue, were faint impressions that hadn't been there before. Not scratches, not pencil. Impressions, as though pressure had warped the emulsion from beneath the surface. They formed no coherent words, just sharp ridges in the form of broken arcs and slanted grooves. Patterns, perhaps. And then the spiral began to move. It was nearly imperceptible, but Thomas saw it. The oil-like residue around the raindrops shifted in a clockwise swirl, just slightly, like a ripple disturbing thick syrup. It didn't pulse. It didn't shudder. It rotated. He stumbled back from the table and slammed the dome shut with both hands. The light in the room dimmed. Gas pressure? Power fluctuation? He didn't know, but the humming of the equipment rose in pitch, and the faint mist crawling across the floor lifted for a moment like static drawn to the ceiling, then fell again like dust disturbed by footsteps. Thomas fled the room. 3 days later, an internal investigation by the university declared the disappearance of Professor Levan unresolved. No signs of struggle, no indication of exit. His key remained in the room. His coat was later found in his office, untouched. He never returned home. The university sealed the image, still under the dome, inside a lead-lined drawer in the sub-basement archives and posted a warning that read simply, "Do not study unsupervised." Access was restricted indefinitely. In 1976, a graduate assistant working on a digitization project misfiled a scan from the Doorbridge archive. The file name read, Rain, undated. It went unnoticed in an internal database for 2 years until a researcher at the Moreland Institute flagged the motion trails in the background as inconsistent with Newtonian precipitation behavior. He wasn't the only one. Since the digital resurfacing of the Trundell image, 11 photographs taken in Brazil, Poland, Indonesia, rural Quebec, and 4 separate counties in the UK have shown the same upward-aligned rain. In every case, the image was captured during complete stillness. No wind, no movement, clear skies. In every case, the humans in the frame appeared undisturbed, static, while water, foliage, or fabric showed motion moving against gravity. Specialists called it partial frame reversal, but no digital artifact or lens malfunction could replicate the spatial consistency. Worse, the spacing between droplets, 3 to 7 centimeters, remained unchanged across continents and decades. Why was it only the inanimate that moved? Why did reversal occur in sections of the image, never the whole frame? And why, in every account, did the room feel colder after viewing, No theory held, no simulation repeated the effect, and no witness once aware could ever truly unsee the motion locked in stillness. The last known instance occurred in February 2021 during a flash photography test in a theater warehouse outside Glasgow. The ceiling was dry, the floor soaked, the fog machine untouched, the camera, a Weston Model B replica, built to specifications from 1878. No further images have been released, but the spiral patterns continue to appear beneath the emulsion when exposed to ultraviolet light. And sometimes, late at night in archive rooms across the world, interns whisper of a low clicking sound, like rain climbing glass. If cases like this fascinate you, subscribe and turn on notifications for the next file. Disclaimer: this script is a work of fiction. Names, characters, places, institutions, and incidents are invented or used fictitiously. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, or actual events is purely coincidental. Created solely for entertainment,